Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
We are going to commence with today's talk, which is brought to us by Michael Millerman. Just to introduce the Stoa, hi, my name is Raven, and today I am going to be hosting this talk, and I'm very excited about it. I have been very influenced by Heidegger, so this talk is of particular interest to me. And the subject today is the current crisis, simultaneously a health crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis, and a crisis of world order, presents us with an opportunity to re-examine some basic concepts and assumptions about ourselves, the systems in which we live, and the usual ways we interpret the events happening with us and around us. This talk argues for the relevance of Martin Heidegger's philosophy of another beginning in understanding and overcoming the crisis. So the way this is going to work is Michael will do about 20 minutes of talking about the subject, and then we will open it up to questions. Please present your questions in the chat and indicate if you would like for me to read the question. Otherwise, I will call on you and you can read your question out loud to Michael. And with that, Michael, handing it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. So I'll go through the prepared remarks and then I look forward to the questions and discussion. So the current crisis, encompassing health, economics, politics, and world order, presents us with an opportunity to re-examine some basic concepts and assumptions about ourselves, the systems in which we live, and the usual ways we interpret the events happening with us and around us. Nobody under these circumstances has a monopoly on sense-making. I think the Stoa, you can see that here. Individuals, groups, info militias, to use Jack Murphy's term, and others, all have an opportunity to contribute to understanding, interpreting, and influencing what's going on beyond the constraints and limitations of traditional channels. So one group of people trying to make sense of what's going on has tried to bring political philosophy, which is my discipline, the area in which I was trained, to bear on the interpretation of the current situation. For example, Ben Woodfinden, a graduate student in political theory in Montreal, has argued that it was our false illusion of technical mastery over political affairs that lulled governments into unpreparedness for the crisis, and he draws here on Machiavelli's teaching about fortuna as a helpful corrective and frame of reference for that analysis. So that's one example of the use of political philosophy, Machiavelli. Carl Schmitt and Thomas Hobbes have also been invoked to help us to reflect on the states of emergency some governments have declared, and on the reassertion of national sovereignty we seem to be witnessing as countries close their borders to travel and invoke special powers to irrigate protective personal equipment and other medical supplies for their doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals. So all such reflections are, to my mind, to be welcomed. Within the political theory tradition, we should be prepared to listen thoughtfully, not only to Machiavelli, Schmitt, and Hobbes, the three examples I just gave, but also to Plato, Aristotle, and the Bible, as well as Zizek, Derrida, and Deleuze, and I think even Nick Land, Steve Bannon, Curtis Yarvin, and others. In short, we should be willing to listen to anyone who's thinking about or has thought about the foundations of human life in its spiritual, political, and social dimensions. So that's the first point, is that there's no problem keeping everything on the table for now. This isn't a talk about having only Heidegger and everybody else off to the side. And yet, what I'd like to bring before you today is what seems to me to be, in general, a neglected alternative when it comes to crisis sense-making, at least among political theorists and political philosophers in the public sphere. So besides the more familiar names I mentioned and other approaches and modalities we can consider during this time, again, many of which you can find at the Stoa, we should pay special attention to what German philosopher Martin Heidegger can teach us about how to interpret ourselves and our moment. So first is, I'm not claiming that nobody talks about Heidegger. I heard him brought up in a recent event here as someone who might help us to think about death, and there's definitely something to that. But some of the most important things he gives us to think about are often downplayed or ignored, perhaps because they're seen as a slippery slope to radical right-wing anti-liberalism, or else they're misunderstood for other reasons. The goal, ultimately, as I see it, is not to talk about Heidegger, for instance, with a biographical curiosity about him as a figure of 20th century intellectual history, like his favorite hat, and he had a pet that he really liked or something like that, or even to trace influences, but rather with Heidegger's help to gain genuine access to ourselves and thereby a better understanding of the nature of our crisis broadly construed. My claim here is that we should consider that there's not only no way out of our crisis, but also no possibility of understanding it for what it is without a foundation in Heidegger's thought. So now a brief introductory comments on Heidegger himself. Heidegger, who was born in 1889 and died in 1976, also addressed himself to a crisis. So we're not the only people who've ever lived through what we think is a crisis. In fact, you might say maybe some of the most interesting thinking happens in the midst of a crisis, or maybe thinking itself always provokes a crisis if it breaks into the foundations of things. But in this case, Writing and Being in Time in 1927, Heidegger discusses how there was then a crisis in the sciences, including in mathematics, that concerned foundational concepts and therefore invited thoughtful philosophical regrounding and reconstitution of those sciences. But that could only happen, he argued, as a result of a more basic inquiry into their structure of being. So fundamental concepts, he wrote, are determinations in which the area of knowledge underlying all the thematic objects of a science attains an understanding that precedes and guides all positive investigation. So I'll just explain. For instance, the concepts of nature and life are presupposed by and guide physics and biology. In other words, he says all sciences somehow treat a region of beings, or they demarcate or delineate some area that is given by a set of fundamental or basic concepts that the science itself doesn't necessarily inquire into with its own methods and as its own subject matter. It's a presupposed guiding horizon. So accordingly, these basic concepts, he writes, first receive their genuine evidence and grounding only in a correspondingly preliminary research into the area itself. To ground the sciences philosophically, in other words, is to clarify the being of their basic concepts through questions like, what is nature? What is life? Or for psychology, what is the soul? And more fundamentally, at the basis of all of these inquiries, what is being itself? The sciences, as I said, do not raise these questions themselves and can't answer them with their own methods, which is why they can't respond to the crisis in their own foundations. It's an invitation for philosophy to step up and do the work. A crisis in the foundations of some established and instituted domain, therefore, invites us to reinterpret those domains in terms of the constitution of their being, using tools of philosophical analysis that must also be properly grounded. So the correct methodological access to the issue of foundations is fundamental for Heidegger. And in this case, we're no longer simply taking for granted an assumed area, as I said, but inquiring into its basis and structure. So for instance, for us and for the question of sense making or meaning making more generally, that kind of inquiry could raise the question, what is meaning, right? What is the being of meaning? What is meaning? Who are we who raise this question? Or as Heidegger asks in the infamous Black Notebooks, who are we and whose are we? And what is the character, nature, or essence of the act of making in the phrase meaning making? How does meaning arise and become a matter of world configuration or world interpretation? And what do we mean by world at all? Those are some elementary inquiries when we begin to think about ourselves as meaning-making beings. So there's a complex of questions here you could say lies a level deeper than the questions that take anything about meaning-making for granted, including, as I said, the issue of who it is doing this activity. Is it consciousness, the soul, the spirit, the individual? And we could easily multiply the list of possible interpretations of the basic unit of action. But Heidegger is suggesting, let's not start with some posited, as I say, consciousness, soul, spirit, but let's try to get a level deeper than that. So what distinguishes Heidegger from the other approaches is precisely his recourse to this deeper level of fundamental ontology, where we're always questioning further into the concealed presuppositions of our thinking. So for instance, we could imagine a conversation about the contemporary situation that relies on analysis in terms of something in Nietzsche. I have nothing against such an approach. And I agree with Peter that if we learn to be performatively agnostic and to maintain such a position experimentally without holding it ourselves, we could learn important things and gain valuable insights. Nevertheless, in Heidegger, the question comes to the forefront as to how the interpretation of being and of human being is grounded in this case. And in fact, Heidegger shows that the interpretation of being as will to power, for instance, to take a fundamental Nietzschean notion, is a distorted interpretation of being in a very precise sense. So let me add, though, that he also considered the careful study of Nietzsche to be indispensable and has 4 volumes on Nietzsche's thought and ponders his significance in a range of writings. So it's not just enough to say, well, will to power is a distorted interpretation of being. You got to also go through the work of studying Nietzsche. But nevertheless, he did show that you can't just operate with Nietzschean notions because ultimately, I believe he showed this successfully, they're not grounded adequately. And the issue of whether an interpretation is well-grounded remains if we start not with the will to power, but with any such concept like consciousness or life or race or any definition of the human being that has not raised the question of how we stand in relation to being as such, which is always implied in any definition, though not always brought out explicitly and with methodological rigor. And here another comment for those of you, I suppose, who know Peter's work or follow it closely. I think you could try to do this with the helpful chart of mimetic tribes by going through to see how each of them defines its basic unit of analysis and its own basic concepts, and deriving these or showing them as partial interpretations of Dasein. And moreover, it could be interesting to try to use Heidegger's tools as a foundation for mimetic mediation, but I just mentioned that in passing. I do think that you could do something like that with the mimetic tribes. So the crisis in the sciences that I mentioned is not the only crisis Heidegger faced. As he writes in his black notebooks, Germany faced an economic and political plight when he accepted the rectorate at the University of Freiburg in 1933. But even in the midst of those crises, he thought what was going on with Dasein and the history of being, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, was the essential matter for Germany in its present and future. So in other words, political crisis, economic crisis, crisis in the sciences, crisis of the academy, all of these somehow are fundamentally rooted in the questions that he raised about our being in relation to being. So neither the attack on liberal bourgeois rationality, nor any proposed solutions of a Christian, cultural, or pagan, folkish kind touched the essential issue at all, however much these might have seemed to some of his contemporaries to offer distinct solutions. And similarly, Heidegger thought that other apparently opposed positions, like materialism and idealism, or subjectivism and objectivism, shared a common root, or rather a common uprootedness from the experience of being, which was for him the most important thing. So when I read that, I wonder whether the solutions proposed to our current crisis, however radically opposed to one another they might appear, don't represent a shared consensus, largely implicit, that there's nothing to worry about on the level of Dasein and what Heidegger called the history of being, such that that issue doesn't even arise or provoke the slightest anxiety, discomfort, or interest. The call for us to turn to the question of being could well seem self-absorbed, overly abstract, or grotesquely out of touch with reality and actuality, with our pressing needs here and now. So you might very well think body bags are piling up and people's RSPs are tanking, and here you are asking us to look into, being. Like that could seem out of touch. Well, Heidegger was well aware that our everyday attitude toward being had the tendency to treat it, if at all, as something empty and abstract. But he believed that this initial attitude could, if we were not in a hurry to get away from it, and to occupy ourselves with something else, give us a truer understanding of ourselves than we normally have. And here I have to say, I tweeted on the spot a couple of days ago that the problem of being, it won't like peel an orange for us. It doesn't have immediate practical implementation. But what is to count as a problem for you, how you're to think about it, how you're implicated in it, how you stand in relation to it, all of that is, Heidegger says, compellingly, I think, very much bound up with this set of questions. So according to Heidegger's thought and teaching, in other words, in a way, nothing matters more to our systems of meaning and acts of meaning making, as well as to our practical, political, religious, and social affairs, than the unthought ways in which they and we are determined by an understanding of being that operates behind our backs. So somehow the unasked question that stands behind us is closer to us than our own breath and our own skin. Okay, if he's right, there's nothing more us than our relation to being. And yet in its unasked state of distance from us, it's over-determining what we're experiencing and what can become, as I say, a problem for us in the first place. I'll carry on if you don't mind. I'll try to go a little bit maybe more quickly. So I wanted to introduce two notions of inauthenticity that we get from Heidegger. The first has to do with the distinction crucial for him and for us if he's right, because again, we're not just reading him as an interesting philosopher, but this is meant to be an indication we ourselves are supposed to become more clear to ourselves in reading him. The first has to do with the distinction between beings and being. Heidegger opposed interpreting the human being in terms of beings, which is what he thought many other interpretations do, like the biological, anthropological, racial, and psychological ones. In a sense, liberalism, communism, and fascism, they're all guilty of interpreting the human being in terms of beings on this narrowly constrained horizon. Well, one form of inauthenticity consists in interpreting ourselves and the world only in terms of beings as we usually encounter them non-philosophically. So the way we usually are in the world, we are amidst the beings, we're among beings, we think, that's the way we think, that's the way we operate. And one form of inauthenticity, or non-self-ownership in some sense, is interpreting ourselves in terms of beings not thought through. So as applied to the crisis, that could mean limiting our view to institutions, supply chains, commonly circulating opinions, graphical representations of infections and deaths. We become to fetishize certain chart formations and so on, stock prices, and even acts of government. So all of that can very well capture our attention, our interest, our curiosity. We can talk about it for a long time. But Heidegger exhorts us instead, or in addition, to remember being even as the technical and organizational aspects of our problem appear most urgent, and as death makes itself felt, not to fail to think about the meaning of our own being towards death. So the first form of inauthenticity, interpreting, collapsing everything into beings, into the goings-on without rooting them. The second form of inauthenticity has to do with Heidegger's notion of the history of being and the possibility of another beginning. So just a side note here, basically there are two problems. One is our entanglement in the world. That's where we get caught up with things. But another one is our entanglement in tradition, in handed down opinions about things, including handed down opinions about being itself. So the second form of authenticity has to do with this history of being. Heidegger thought that the understanding of being itself has undergone fundamental transformations since it was first put into question by ancient Greek philosophers. He thought that in Plato, the original experience of the revelation of being had started to wane and to conceal itself from the thinking human. So it's sort of like you have this moment at the beginning, the philosophical beginning of philosophy, where being reveals itself to the thinkers and then gradually begins to pull away, or we pull away from being, being pulls away from us. It's a motion in two directions in a sense. So he thought that was already happening in Plato, and that it continued to do so through a number of epochal transformations. And one such transformation in the history of being, according to Heidegger, was the momentous translation of the Greek terms for truth and its opposite into Latin, from which we get falsum and veritas, and false and verify, all the English cognates. Because, as Heidegger shows, the new Latin words reflected a completely different experience of the essence of being. Not different and equally profound, but rather distorted and alienated from the true experience of falling away and forgetting of being that became instituted in language. And then other key transformations occurred in medieval scholasticism, in Descartes, in Kant, and in Nietzsche. The point is that even once we've moved our focus from beings to being, assuming we have done so at all, we still have to make sure we're getting being itself right and not just operating with one of its specific, distorted, uprooted configurations. We can do that through what Heidegger called the destruction of metaphysics, which examines all of these great thinkers from the point of view of their understanding of being. And as we think about this crisis and our solutions to it, especially on the level of what it means for the self-understanding of individuals and communities, if we follow Heidegger, we should be on guard then against metaphysical interpretations of the problem or the solution. So for example, a religious revival, so I already said, supply chains and all of that, that's one temptation, just to fall into the technological organizational side of the problem and the solution. But even if you go to something like a religious response, Heidegger says we want to beware of an interpretation of the basic concepts again, like God, soul, providence, punishment, justice, right? All of the potential basic concepts from the theological domain here would also have to be grounded in fundamental ontology. Likewise, you could say an atheistic response, overly atheistic response, that still has to ground its basic concepts. So let me jump ahead because I know I've been going on. And the basic idea is that Heidegger thinks he has this idea or project of another beginning of philosophy. So if you do the work of digging into Dasein and you do the work of digging into the inherited concepts of ontology, there's the possibility or the prospect of standing before being itself and inaugurating a new era, a new history of philosophy. And he uses this image that philosophies are like peaks in a mountain range. The great philosophies are like peaks in a mountain range. They configure the height, the depth, and the breadth of the territory. But Heidegger's new beginning wouldn't just be another mountain, like Kant, Descartes, and the rest of them. It would be a new range, a new space, time for thought to configure its own territories. So it's kind of hard to convey not using an image if you're not already initiated into Heidegger's way of speaking, but the idea of a philosophy of a new beginning is supposed to be something like that. So 2 more quick comments and I'll stop. I've gone over time, I know. According to Heidegger, we're transformed as a function of the being historical eras or epochs. So it's only with Descartes that we can interpret ourselves as subject and object. It's only with Nietzsche we can interpret ourselves as will to power, ourselves in the world. And I want to say for the record, this is something like Leo Strauss's reminder that in classical political philosophy, most people are determined for the most part by the type of regime they belong to. So you have not just man, but democratic man or liberal democratic man, aristocratic man, or the Homo Sovieticus, right? Soviet human type. Human types as given as a function of the political regime. This is similar, but here Heidegger's talking about regimes of being. So it somehow takes it even a step further. And what I wanted to say in closing here is that the opportunity that the current crisis presents us with, I would say, is the following. If we accept Heidegger's invitation to turn to fundamental ontology as a source of self-understanding that lies at the basis of our world order, economy, institutions of health, and systems of everyday life, then together with the deconstruction of metaphysics, we'd have to make the task of another beginning of philosophy our own and start to experiment with the concept formation of a Dasein politics, not a politics of soul, politics of spirit, but Dasein politics. This prospect is more radical and less likely than some of the better known alternatives, and also more essential. The only political philosopher I know of who has accepted the challenge openly, unconcerned about the supposed slope to radical right-wing anti-liberalism, is Alexander Dugan, whose 4th political theory should therefore be of particular interest to us in this our Heideggerian moment. Sorry, I went on a bit.
That was absolutely excellent.
Thanks.
So much richness there. So excited that you're bringing this to the Stoa so that we can begin to think about what a new beginning of philosophy is, which I have also found Heidegger to be extremely instructive in this project with the question of being as such. So I was wondering though, so you were using this word Dasein. And I think even for people who have read Heidegger, Dasein, and a lot of the terminology that he uses is mysterious. Do you mind kind of describing and unpacking that word and the particular way that Heidegger treats it in his work and how it relates to thinking of being as such?
So one of the ways to think about it is that if you start with the interpretation of the human being as an individual, or the interpretation of the human being as a subject, or the interpretation of the human being as a soul, and you want to say, is there some thing on the basis of which all of those interpretations are taking place? Is there some X underlying these potentially more partial and limited interpretations of what it means to be a human being? And then you can point out that hypothetical X, as Dasein. So Dasein is the name that we give to the being that underlies all self-interpretations of the human being as something else. That's one way to see it. Mm-hmm. He says in Being and Time that if somehow we have begun to wonder about what being is, and the issue is that it's always implied in what we say and in how we conduct ourselves. So one of his examples is, I say the door is open. Well, I understand that. There's the door. You can't see it, but I can. There's the door, and it's open. I know door, I know open, and I also know is without really stopping to think about it, right? Mm-hmm. So, and if I say there is a bird, or there was silence on the mountaintop, he gives various different examples. The understanding of being is always implied. So he says, what if I wanted to actually dig into that a little bit deeper? I wanted to get a fundamental or conceptual grasp on this being that I always seem to pre-understand. Well, I could look, if I wanted to learn about mineralogy, I could go study minerals. If I wanted to do oceanography, I could go study the ocean, right? But if I want to understand being, is there something that has privileged access to the question of being? And he argues that it would seem to be we who raised the question in the first place, we who are constituted with a pre-philosophical understanding of being. So Dasein names we ourselves sort of at its barest level as exposed to and interested in being prior to the interpretation of ourselves as something else, like individual or subject. Later, in some other writings, he hyphenates Dasein, so that's Da-Sein, and really that, I would say, names what we become when we're transformed by the revelation of being. So it's something, so one sense of Dasein is you sitting there, all of you listening, each of you listening, sitting there is Dasein. You might think of yourself as an I, you might think of yourself as a self. You might have a spiritual or yoga tradition or whatever tradition you interpret yourself through. But at the basis of all of that, according to Heidegger, would be what he calls Dasein. For the formation of the word is sort of like da has a spatial component of there, and sign is really the like to be. So you are a place where being happens, or you are the localization of being. So Dasein is, you got to think about it, I would say, like that. It's what you are underneath your self-interpretations that can give you access to being itself if you dig a little. Is that helpful?
So helpful.
Okay.
Oh my God. Oh my God, I've been trying to unpack that word for so long. I do want to open up questions to everybody in the group. So just make sure that, I just want everyone to know that you're invited to type your questions into the chat.
And let me just add one thing again for the benefit of people who may. So one of the ways Heidegger defines or expands on the notion of Dasein in being in time is he says who you are is being in the world. Okay? Being in the world as a composite entity. So you are always already together with world. It's not like in here is the subject, out there is the world, and I must build a bridge from my inside to the outside, and the whole problem of bridge building therefore becomes thematic. You see, it's not that those things are always given together and composite. So we are always already co-constituted by an understanding of what world is. Again, understanding means just initial. We may not have turned it over and over to make it clear, but we always have some understanding of world and of beings in the world. So that's another way, that gives a rich set of things that you could look at, like what is being in, for example. So Heidegger says a cup, okay, take a bowl, I put a pebble in a bowl. The pebble is in the bowl in one way. Its mode of being in is like being inside of a container. But the way we're in the world is not as something inside a container. We're in the world as co-constituted with a world. So he begins to examine all of these components of our everyday understanding that we take for granted and deepens them to their underlying structure, to their what he calls their existentials, the structures of our being. Okay.
Yeah, great. So we've got some questions coming in. And so Peter, you have a question here. Would you like to ask Michael your question?
Mm-hmm. So Mike, I got to double click on the mimetic mediator drop there, mentioned drop. So do you have any additional thoughts on how Heidegger may help with the mimetic mediation process?
So I think that if he's right that somehow the basic concepts or units of analysis are modes of Dasein's self-interpretation or modes of some more fundamental underlying. You see, so if we were to treat the Heideggerian alternative as one of a number of mimetic tribes, which it could be, at some extent, could be the Heideggerians who yap on and on about being, and they ignore race or whatever else, or, however you might set them alongside the others. That is there's probably something to that. But if we also were to take, put all of the mimetic tribes horizontally, for example, in your imagination, right? And with lines going down to this Dasein and show what existential structures that Heidegger has identified, like modes of authenticity, modes of inauthenticity, modes of temporality, projections of past, present, and future, what is decided on as the existential moment, which I think, didn't you have a talk somehow having to do with different modes of time earlier in the day? But if we take that down to Heidegger's methodological tools, I think we would be able to say to each of the mimetic tribes, how, and basically remember, he comes, a lot of the times, he's getting to the foundation by asking the right kinds of questions. So he shows, for example, to his own contemporaries that both the communists and the liberals and the Nazis and the Christians, you know, each have presupposed some basic concept that they themselves cannot account for. And somehow there may be a potential, a Socratic type potential, to lead each of the mimetic tribes into its own aporia. You know, and potentially if you lead each of the mimetic tribes into their own aporia, not necessarily from the point of view of another of the tribes, which you could do, but from a methodologically, you know, triangulated position, one dimension below. So that was my intuition. Like, I see that he's doing something similar in a sense with his own alternatives by showing that they share a root, and not just by showing it, but by giving methodological access to further analysis and unpacking and deconstruction. And again, deconstruction has the positive significance of bringing to light what the guiding horizons are. So that chart, the mimetic tribes chart, is very helpful, I think, in indicating like the key players, the key concepts, some key notions, right? What even like their bumper sticker slogans, right? But as I say, if we can bring all of that down to the existentials of Dasein and show them as modes of interpretation, it just seemed to me like there could be something there.
Yeah, it's sparking a lot of thoughts. The other question I had to pivot to Dugan, another Dugan drop, and then just leave it off. So with the, yeah, you said he was the only one who's taking up this process.
Yeah, as far as I know, I mean, I did write on this topic for my dissertation at the University of Toronto. It's going to be coming out as a book. And I did look to see, you know, I read a lot about Heidegger in political theory, Heidegger in political philosophy. It was a comparative study of receptions of Heidegger. So I looked at the French, the American, the German. And I think that largely the interpretation of Heidegger's philosophy has stood in the shadow of his involvement with the Nazis, which, I mean, you can understand that to a certain extent. The concern that he never denounced as openly or as vigorously or as publicly, as expressly or as contritely as his critics and even some of his erstwhile supporters might have liked, you know, his involvement with the Nazis, or his support, however unqualified it might have been, for the Nazis. So somehow I think there was a concern. This is also interesting because it shows you the geocultural, geopolitical aspect of philosophy. You see that aspects of Heidegger's thinking were left off the table, and I would say even in some cases systematically, purposefully, either repressed or distorted, because it was thought that they are, how would you put it, like isomorphic or functionally analogous to, you know, support for Nazism. So if you think that his being historical narrative of the trajectory towards nihilism is leaves you with no moral political compass to differentiate between, let's say, totalitarian and non-totalitarian regimes or something like that, because he thinks they're all totalitarian, you know? So somehow, like the French, let me put it to you this way. There's in, again, political philosophy, political theory, there's a writer named Alan Bloom, professor, academic teacher, wrote on Plato, translated, I think he translated The Republic, okay? Translated Plato's Republic, wrote great works on Rousseau and so on. He's got a book called Closing of the American Mind. And there's a chapter there called The Nietzscheanization of the Left, which discusses how Nietzsche was also co-opted by and reinterpreted by, put into the service of leftist political aims in academia. Something similar happened with Heidegger. He was very influential, extremely influential. Once one guy said in the 1980s that basically all of French philosophy is completely dominated by Heidegger. His impact is immeasurable on these thinkers. Many of the times when you talk about you know, postmodern neo-Marxist left or something like that, 5 steps behind the figurehead that you see over here, there's Heidegger thinking up on the, you know, he's a giant, giant force over many schools of thought where the connection doesn't even seem clear unless you know it. But it's happened that his influence has been mostly either the rejection of Heidegger by liberal centrists or the reinterpretation of his thought by the left in the service of unpacking what they thought were like grand narratives or so look, if they say there's no truth with a capital T, that's constructed historically. You know, there's no basis to what you call metaphysics. You thought metaphysics were stable structures that you could rely on for your politics, like a politics of natural right, for example, like Leo Strauss has. you thought you could rely on metaphysics or like a Christian, politics of soul and providence or something. But no, they would say, these are all contingent. They can be deconstructed, and you can show them that they're all formations on an abyss. So in some sense, the left Heideggerians accepted his deconstruction of metaphysics, where he destabilized the traditional interpretation of ourselves in the world. But they left out of the picture this massively essential part of his project, which is the possibility of another beginning. I mean, it's more nuanced to a certain extent, and he had some very good readers on the left, including Derrida. But roughly, the idea of another beginning was not picked up by anybody, I think, largely for political purposes. Dugan is writing outside, in a way, of the context of Western European history after the Second World War. He's less constrained in terms of his interpretive resources than the French, the Americans, and the Germans, for sure. So partially, the fact that it's a Russian reception of Heidegger is already a factor in why they can think about a new beginning. All the more so when it seems from many geographical and geopolitical points of view, that the West is indeed going over some sort of nihilistic cliff or something like that. So, and there are things that Heidegger himself said about Russia's like ontological significance. So there are many, many factors that line up, and Dugan has also the intellectual interest that somehow primed him for this as a sort of like anti-modern philosopher king of sorts. But it's really remarkable because he's jumped into this project of another beginning, whereas most other readers of Heidegger don't just not jump into it. They basically won't even acknowledge it, or they'll acknowledge it just to immediately take it down. So I think he's got great relevance for us in giving us access to Heidegger and to the latent political philosophical potentials in Heidegger's thought.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I got to get Dugan on the Stoa now. I'm stoked. Cool. Thanks, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I got to say, I mean, let me just add one thing that makes Dugan interesting as a reader of Heidegger. So he's not just saying, let's look at, some books that have their On the Bed, Being in Time, Contributions to Philosophy of Event, not just let's read Heidegger, but he actually extends Heidegger's methods and intuitions. So for example, one of Dugan's main ideas is that there's not just Dasein, but taking his lead from Heidegger, who spoke about German Dasein, for example, Dugan postulates the existential plurality of Daseins. In other words, people are different, not just culturally, not just because they eat different foods and grew up under different climate or something like that, but are fundamentally all one similar humanity. He tries to trace a difference in the relationship to being as such among peoples through an existential analysis of their language. And this is like the Heideggerian foundation of his theory of a multipolar world. So he's taking Heidegger, he himself says, he's taking Heidegger's methodology and what's implicit in him, and he's very much experimenting with it actively. Cross-pollinations, weird combinations, superimpositions, and it's pretty interesting. So,
Excellent, great, thank you. So we're going to move to Key. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Hi.
hello.
Thank you for going into detail about this topic that was completely new to me. So I appreciated the way that you explained it logically. And so here is the question. You kind of brushed over regimes of being. I was curious about what you have to say about that. But I also just wanted to say yay for the existential existential plurality of Dasein. So that's my question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Dugan has this passage in the Fourth Political Theory where he says, I don't know why it is that let me just take a step back for a minute. The idea of a fourth political theory that he has says, neither liberal, nor communist, nor fascist. Therefore, we're going to carve out an alternative that rejects all of them as inauthentic versions of human existence constructed on the horizon of modernity. That's interesting because usually, I don't know if you've encountered this, for me it was in my face all throughout academia, the assumption is that if you are not a liberal and you're not to the left of liberalism, you can only be a fascist. There's no other terminological category. Now things have become probably more complex to a certain extent. maybe even especially after Trump's victory, where all of these other phenomena had to be accounted for somehow. But Dugan marks out this fourth political theory territory. And when he's talking about this existential multiplicity of Dasein, it's of a piece in that theory. And he writes in the book called The Fourth Political Theory, when people hear about it, I'm surprised that they don't open a bottle of champagne and celebrate, because the possibilities are so exciting. So that's when I hear the yay for existential plurality, I hear excitement about possible ways of thinking that may not necessarily be customary or obvious, where you can't already predict what all the outcomes will be. So I share the excitement for the possibilities of thinking. As far as the regimes of being, so I wanted to have, again, Strauss on the record, because he's a helpful corrective to Heidegger in some way. But the basic analogy was that a regime of being would be like a stage in what Heidegger called the history of being, a phase, an era, an epoch, where being there had been some essential transformation in our understanding of being. And we ourselves are interpreted as a flip side of that understanding of being. So for example, this is, he would say that when modern subjectivity was constituted in the philosophy of Descartes, and we don't have to go obviously into the details of how that happened, it's not just a new understanding of being, which it is, it's also a new understanding of human being. So my analogy was, just like in Plato, as brought out by Strauss, but also in Aristotle, the political regimes produce a political anthropological type, like liberal democratic type for the liberal democratic regime, Soviet type for the Soviet regime, fascist type for the fascist regime, and so on. So ontologically, there's like the will to power and the anthropological version of the will to power. There's mathematical rationality and the as a definition of being, but then there's also the mathematically rational human being. So that's the idea of regimes of being. That there's this two sides of the coin. How we interpret being as such shines a light on how we interpret the human being. And if there's a history to that, as Heidegger claimed, and if that history is not just arbitrary, but actually represents a falling away from the original experience of being, or an alienation of being, or forgetting of being, then it's very important. Then you could say that, Nietzsche's observation that the last man corresponds to the phase of nihilism is a version of the anthropology that matches our ontological moment, or our, how did I put it, ontological regime, or regime of being. And so if there is going to be, and this is really a future project that requires philosophical inquiries of this type, if there's going to be a philosophy of another beginning, then there's also going to be the political anthropology of another beginning. And Dugan's worked on that a little bit. I have some thoughts, mostly just following his experiments in that for now. But that's really what I mean by regimes of being.
Could you go into that then? If that's okay.
Well, into the anthropology of another beginning, or
yes.
So, I mean, the starting point, if we follow Heidegger here, would be, let's begin with Dasein. So we're no longer talking about the individual or the community. That's a false dichotomy, okay, in this sense, because Dasein, you shouldn't interpret it one way or another yet, or about the race, or about the nation, or about the state, or consciousness, spirit, soul, rhizome, all of the potential things that you can interpret as. Start with Dasein, and we would follow Heidegger in his existential analysis, where he says, okay, so we are being in the world. So we have a specific mode of being in. We have a specific mode of being with each other, being with others, right? And our being is also, as he puts it, always already ahead of itself, caring for things in the world. So this defines our structure. It's not just something we do sometimes, not other times. To be the being that we are is always already to be ahead of ourselves, projecting, having projects, and to have been thrown into existence together with the world. So Dugan, for example, he has a lecture on Dasein politics, where first he presents, you could say, the traditional Neoplatonic version of politics as a reflection of the city in speech, the perfect city as imagined by the philosopher, let's say. And no, that's not accurate. But basically, the Platonic city that's built on the model of excellence from the top down, and then the Heideggerian city that's built on this existential foundation from the bottom up. And he sort of does this mapping of one onto the other, you know, in terms of how they see the future, whether it's open or not, and all of that. So it would require getting into some methodological, you know, nuance, terminological nuance, and so on. But even how we think about space, so about how we think about spatiality, you know, about the relationship between language, existence, and territory. All of that, basically, Heidegger refashions all of that for us. Or to use maybe a image that may be familiar to you from philosophy, Plato's Republic, where you have the person who's in the cave, he's chained, he can't turn his head, he's only looking at the shadows that are cast on the wall, but he doesn't know they are shadows, he just treats them as reality. It's only once he's seen something else that he can see them as shadows. Well, everything looks different when in the spot where you are, you accomplish a revolution of your soul. Because when you're looking at the shadows, that's one mode of existence. When you have performed a revolution of your soul, that's another mode of existence. In other words, when you undergo the turning around that takes you from what is ordinary and everyday and customary to the possibility of a philosophical ascent or a deepening, everything changes. And it's similar in Heidegger. Our understanding of everything potentially can change, of power, of constitutions, the search for power, of justice, of communities, how we identify the relevant communities, of the relationship between thought and practice, of morality, and all of this. So even if you think, just to say one more word about this, if you say Nietzsche has been relevant to political practice to a certain extent because he offers a non-liberal, anti-liberal, classical alternative. Well, if we acknowledge that Nietzsche has had some effect, Heidegger comes along and he says that Nietzsche has interpreted the Greek world completely Romanly. His understanding of the political, of the politics, is all misses the mark. And he doesn't just say it. I mean, in my view, he demonstrates it as thoughtfully as can be done. So what this really opens up is a whole realm of possibilities for interpreting ourselves and the world, therefore also political life, which is ourselves in the world, right? It's a certain specific type of projection of being with others in the world, opens up a whole new set of possibilities. And what's beautiful, if Heidegger's right about ourselves, what's beautiful about this set of possibilities is that it's not just constructed on the sands of something else that has been constructed on the sands of something else that lacks foundation, and that can just be another, you know, bubble in the foam, bubbling up and, you know, popping and going back down to soap or something like that. It's supposed to be, if Heidegger's right about ourselves and our interpretation of being and time, this is rootedness and not an uprootedness. You know, it's an understanding of ourselves as we are truly, it would seem, and not as we are seen through a glass darkly. Okay, well, something like that.
Excellent, thank you. Rachel, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, so I just had another question come up after the last discussion, but I'm curious about design, if aura would be a modern New Age interpretation of it, what are the differences, where essence would come in?
So I think that thinking about ourselves in terms of auras, in terms of chakras, and in fact, in terms of the richly elaborated system of the human being available in some systems of, of yoga. One of the best books I read a year or two ago on Kundalini Yoga had a very interesting account of the chakras and how they configure our personalities and all of that. I return to my initial comments where I said everything should be on the table. So I do think that that interpretation of political life and of human life should be on the table. In fact, I mentioned even in my dissertation defense back in university days that I think there should be more political philosophy of the chakras type thing, and they let me get away with it, which I was a little bit surprised by, but I do think so. However, it's not the way that Heidegger would think about Dasein, because it's still looking at some like mechanical or organic or biological or psychobiological, you know, or even however you put it, it's still, for example, if you say that it still is in the realm, it's still an interpretation of ourselves taken from the realm of beings and not from being as such. So he's really not looking for any like, you know, this is your subtle body type interpretation, right? And those models can get complicated and they're very interesting, like I said, but it's different. You could ask about the astral body you could ask about the being itself of the astral body. So there you already see a distinction, right, between the interpretation of ourselves as aura, astral body, chakra, and so on, and the domain that asks about the being of that. So his emphasis is really on how do we constitute an understanding of the being as such of anything, whether it's, you know, our neuronal activity, our auric activity, our psychic activity, our you know, gastronomic activity, right? He doesn't want to reduce an interpretation of the human being to any one of those regions or slices, however important it is. And he doesn't deny that you have to eat and walk and fall in love and all of that. But nevertheless, he thinks what's most fundamental and implied by all of these is that somehow we think about them that they are and take their being for granted, and therefore stand in some pre-understood notion of being. And that's the domain that he wants to clarify. So I can imagine, you know, in some distant future, the question, imagine you could put on a pair of glasses and see a person's aura and see their chakras, how they're spinning, how they look, what color they are, how they're interacting with other people's chakras. It would be genuinely very interesting to me personally to know, how does self-interpretation of the regimes of being and human being look from that point of view? You know, I think that that's fair to ask. And I even have some thoughts about how that might work. But that would be our expansion of Heidegger's methodology into a new set of questions and possibilities. But it's not how he interprets Dasein.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Okay, so I feel like you're talking about almost like genetic occultism, sort of like in the realm of someone like Yuval Harari, but with more of a scientific explanation. Is that right, or am I misinterpreting you?
I still think it's too much on the level of what Heidegger would say beings, because it's not genetic in the terms of genes, and it's not scientific in the terms of the study of realities, or I mean, there's not a better word for it, I would say, than beings. He's saying all of that, take beings as a whole, everything that is, everything about it that you can say that it is, whether it's a gene or anything else, okay? He says that, take that whole domain of beings as a whole, and distinct from beings as a whole is being as such. Because all of these beings, they are in being. Somehow, that's the fact that they are in being is already distinct from the fact that they're beings. You see what I'm saying? So it's almost like, okay, I can remember very clearly where I was and what I was doing and what I was thinking and how the world spun for me, so to speak, the moment when I myself conducted Descartes' meditation on first philosophy, okay, where you doubt everything and you get to this unshakable certainty of yourself. It's not like, it's actually, it requires like the ice breaks moment or the penny drops moment. It's really not just, it's a total like initiation sort of, or transformation or break, reconfiguration. So something like that, I think, is helpful in getting this ontological difference between beings and being. And because I can see you're already tempted to take being into beings. Is it the aura? Is it the genes? You know, is it this? Is it that? It's not any one thing, and it's not even the totality of things. It's this ontological distinction between beings and being. And all I can do is indicate it. All Heidegger could do is indicate it. And in his lecture, for example, on Plato's cave allegory and on the essence of truth, he says at the beginning to his students, he says, you don't need to be able to speak Greek or read Greek. You don't need to have an excellent mastery of the tradition of philosophy that we're looking at here. All that you need at any moment in this lecture, and he says this elsewhere too, is a readiness sort of to, on the spot, undergo this conversion experience. You know, so somehow all the time reading Heidegger, and I believe this is true from his earliest to his latest writings, reading Heidegger is being prepared for a conversion experience. But it's a conversion experience of a particular kind. It's not conversion experience into one thing or another. It's really conversion into this domain that's demarcated by the distinction between beings and being. So that's all I can say.
Great. That was a great place to end. May this be the origin of a kind of new being for the people here who are being exposed to Heidegger right now. Wow, Michael, thank you for such a stimulating talk. There's so much here to dig into, and I hope that we can continue having this conversation at the Stoa about Heidegger and maybe the possibility space that he brings to us in terms of thinking in the beginning of something. So,
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Yeah, excellent. And the Stoa, we see this as a gift to everyone, to all of humanity. And if you feel inspired to give a gift to the Stoa, you can visit the website under the gift economy and make a contribution there. And with that, Peter, do you have any other final words?
Yeah, go to the website. You can check out upcoming events. Let's see if we have, what do we have? We have collective presencing. So it's like a WeSpace practice. And that's 12 p.m. Eastern time. And then we got this badass chick coming at 10 p.m. And she's here right now. Rachel, do you want to go off mute and tell us what your event's about?
Yes, I'm not camera ready right now, but I'm giving a talk on aesthetics and movements, and we're going to cover art, literature, music, philosophy, and how we can create an aesthetic movement during the time of crisis.
And it just so happened to be before that, 2 hours before that, we're going to have a session called Emancipate the Daemon, and I'm going to be facilitating that one, and I have no idea what that's going to be about, so we'll find out.
I love the name. I'm really looking forward to this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, everyone. Take care. Thanks,
Great,
Raven.
thank you.
Thanks, Michael.